Okay, good morning, everyone. My name is Zoe Heisler. I am an MPH student at the CUNY School for Public Health studying health policy and management. And I did a cost analysis or return on investment analysis at ORCI for the breast cancer screening program. So Darcy already provided a lot of really good information about background about breast cancer. As she mentioned, it's the most prevalent cancer among women in the world, but in Tanzania specifically, it's actually the second most after cervical cancer, and it comprises around 14.4% of new cancer cases. Also, as Darcy mentioned, 80% of the women in Tanzania who are diagnosed with breast cancer are diagnosed at a late stage. And specifically, a small study taking place at ORCI from 2007 through 2009 found that 90% of the cases there were late stage. This is important for my study because treatment of breast cancer is less effective and more expensive as it progresses from stage 1 to stage 4. So return on investment analyses generally depend on the fact that there will be savings on the cost of treatment when you diagnose at an earlier stage, which offset the cost of the screening program. And then just to contextualize analyses of breast cancer screening programs in Africa in general, there have been studies in Ghana and Egypt that have found them breast cancer screening programs to be cost effective or yield a positive return on investment, respectively. So my work in Tanzania at ORCI was two-pronged. First, I had to define my cohort. So the cohort for this study are patients diagnosed with breast cancer seeking treatment at ORCI from 2016 through 2018. I got the list of cohort from a previous student for 2016, 2017, and 2018 patients were abstract from a patient logbook. There were some issues with that as well, but creative problem solving. And then ultimately I used written and electronic medical records in order to get information about treatment. So the treatment type, the treatment cost, treatment frequency, the dates of treatment, and obviously whether patients were screened or not, in addition to demographic information such as age, gender, location, religion, tribe, and occupation. In regards to the second portion is the actual cost analysis. So I needed to figure out how much treatment costed, the cost of treatment, as well as the cost of operating the screening clinic. So once I had gathered some data from the cohort and felt I was comfortable understanding the types of treatments generally offered at ORCI, I started meeting with doctors, nurses, and accountants. The purpose of meeting with the doctors and nurses was threefold. One was to understand the process and protocols and reasonings behind the way that screening and treatment takes place. The second was to understand the amount of time that they dedicate to treating breast cancer so that I could then, later when I run my ROI analysis, allocate the appropriate proportion of their salaries towards breast cancer treatment or screening. And then additionally, along the lines of understanding their processes is to kind of pick up any additional resources that they might be using in the course of treatment or screening that I may not have considered before I started. And once I did those, I was able to better reach out to the accountants, who I ended up giving a spreadsheet to listing all the costs for the treatment center as well as costs for the screening program, laying out both direct and indirect costs. So overhead and stuff like the value of the space, electricity, things like that, in addition to the cost of the drugs themselves and the administration of those drugs. I got a very varied responses from these accountants, so I ultimately reviewed all the information regarding costs with Dr. Musalagi, who's the executive director of ORCI, providing him with the variance, mean, and mode, and he ultimately told me which would be the most accurate figure for all of my criteria. So in terms of just overview of some of the results of my interviews, 8 doctors and nurses were interviewed more than once to get all the information I mentioned. Six accountants were interviewed in addition to Dr. Musalagi at the end reviewing. From the data I was able to receive from previous students, I averaged that around 3,942 people are screened per year. The next few things refer to the amount of time that staff are allocated towards breast cancer. So speaking to nurses in the chemo room, they estimated that 40% of the patients that they're helping and providing treatment for were for breast cancer. The way that ORCI is also structured is that there is an insurance wing and there's a non-insurance wing, and they structure treatment differently. So in the non-insurance wing, they have subgroups of doctors who specialize and treat certain types of cancer. So there's actually only one firm, as they refer to it, that deals with breast cancer. So of the 3 doctors within that firm, they estimated that about 80% of their time is dedicated towards treating breast cancer. While the insurance board, the doctors treat all types of cancer, so they estimated that around 35% of their time is allocated towards breast cancer. And then regarding the treatment clinic, the screening clinic rather, they estimated, the doctors and nurses, that around 30% of the people who come to the screening clinic come primarily for breast cancer screening. However, they do have a policy of dual screening, so anyone who's coming in for cervical cancer screening will also be screened for breast cancer and vice versa. And this will be relevant later. So just some information about my cohort itself. There were 730 patients who were diagnosed with breast cancer and at least sought treatment at ORCI, whether they completed it or not, and were able to be defined as screened or unscreened conclusively. Here, there is some data. As you can see, there isn't a ton of difference between the age or the stage or religion, or many of the other demographic information from the screened and unscreened groups. In fact, the only statistically significant analysis I was able to run for a chi-square was whether they were from the Dar es Salaam region or not. So patients who were screened were more likely to be from Dar es Salaam than those who were not screened. And there's also an age distribution on the board where you can kind of see that the distribution, though obviously much smaller because the screened was less than 10% of the total cohort, kind of mirrors the unscreened. In terms of the treatment information, this is an old version of this presentation. So actually the average number of chemo treatments prescribed was 7.8 for the screened and 7.3 for unscreened. So ignore the 4.7 and 5.2. But basically, there was no statistically significant difference between the average number of treatments prescribed between groups as well as the average number of chemo treatments actually received, or the number of radiation treatments received between both groups. In addition, I will not be including hormone therapy in my cost analysis when it happens because I was not confident about the reliability about the number of treatments prescribed and received by the patients. So that's definitely a limitation of my study as a whole. Ultimately, though, I was able to calculate the average total cost of direct medical care, excluding labor, for both the screened and unscreened groups. The figures on the board are in Tanzanian shilling, so just to contextualize this for you, for the screened group, that 2 million shilling is around $895, whereas the unscreened group, 1.9, is around $835. So first we see here that the screened is ever so slightly higher than the unscreened, though not statistically significantly so, which is not what you hope to see in an ROI analysis. And then just to kind of explain a little bit further what I meant by direct cost of treatment. So it's the chemo drugs, pre-chemo drugs, lab tests that you need before treatment, like full blood pictures, renal function tests, liver function tests, chest x-rays that they perform before someone starts a whole course of treatment, chemo administration fees, radiation therapy costs. And again, here you can see the distribution of number of treatments received as well as the cost of treatment in millions, and you see that, again, they seem pretty much in line. Initial conclusions. So first, regarding the screening clinic, I was able to obtain the budget and actual amounts spent per year on the screening clinic. So for things like advertising and educational materials, you can see the amount that they spend annually. Just wanted to explain that clinic overhead here means the value of the space, electricity, water, security, furniture, all of that. And then I basically took the total cost of operating the screening clinic and divided it into, this is subject to change when I write my manuscript, but because of dual screening, I've thought that it would be appropriate for the purpose of this presentation to attribute 50% of operating the screening clinic towards breast cancer, and then I divided that by the total average number of people screened per year to get the average cost of screening per person, which is around 63,000 Tanzanian shilling, which amounts to around $27. So just looking at this information, it does not seem that the ORCI breast cancer screening clinic yields a positive return on investment. There's no statistically significant difference between the cost of screening and the cost of treatment, between the cost of treatment between groups, or the number of treatments between groups. In terms of recommendations for this, I would say that more education is needed to encourage women to screen, especially asymptomatically. I mentioned earlier that 90% of patients in a 2007 to 2009 study were late stage. In mine, it was more between 70 to 80%. So that's definitely some indication of improvement, but there's obviously a lot more to do. Something I'll touch on in a minute is also streamlining and centralizing financial information, and then also just tracking the progress of treatment for women who are screened and suspicious of breast cancer who may not have sought treatment at ORCI, because my project only dealt with those who came to ORCI for treatment. In terms of the learning experience itself, it was a really good opportunity to learn about data collection and gathering data from multiple sources and organizing it, determining inclusion and exclusion criteria, also from project management, just to pace myself and make sure that I'm on track for what I wanted to accomplish. One of the biggest lessons I learned was about persistence and communication. I basically was being referred from one accountant to the next or from one doctor to the next, and there came a point where I just wasn't getting enough accountants, so I just marched into the accountant's room and very politely asked someone if they were accountant, and then asked for their time, and they ended up being really helpful and added new ideas to my study and also referred me to other accountants. So I think that that persistence and being able to communicate politely but persistently is really important. Darcy and Lindsay both already mentioned that we were able to, obviously we all learned about cancer, but we were also able to talk about cancer with high school students in Dar es Salaam about what cancer is, screening, and treatment. Again, in terms of learning experience, this is an earlier version, so instead of scheduling on Tanzania time, I would say being flexible and understanding and adapting to different cultural norms. So where I might say, are we meeting at 1 and expect to meet at 1, it might not happen until 2 or 3 o'clock. So just being patient and flexible and persistent was really important in this experience. Over here, in the corner, that's the cancer registry room. I worked with them. They were the best people in the world. This was when we spoke to the students, and this is our on-site mentor, Dr. Masami, and that's Darcy, who you just saw. For future research opportunities for C students, I think there's a lot that can be done. I think that one of the things that I would really recommend is that following the screened patients to see whether at surrounding hospitals to determine if they receive treatment or diagnosis there. My study was limited because I was only looking at ORCI, but chemo is available as is surgery at other hospitals around Tanzania and even Dar es Salaam. So I think that to really measure the success of the screening clinic, it would be important to look at other hospitals. I also think that from a more epidemiological and less economic sense, students could use this information and look at compliance of treatment, because I kind of was able to determine how much was prescribed for chemo and then how much they followed through. So I think it might be an interesting thing to look at to see if there are any associated factors with the compliance or lack thereof of completing a course of treatment. The research site analysis was overwhelmingly a positive experience. there are definitely areas for improvement, such as Darcy mentioned also, increasing the robustness of the EMR. There were things that would be located in the written files, but not in the EMR, and I think that integrating those a little bit more thoroughly would definitely be helpful for future students doing research, and also ties into improving the file location and availability. There were around 30 cases I was unable to include in my study because they were unable to locate their files. So, I mean, it was less than 10% of my cohort, so it was okay, but I think that would improve also with improving the EMR. I think also in standardizing the staging information for breast cancer in the EMR would be extremely helpful for future research being performed, and centralizing financial information. The fact that I was able to get from 6 different accountants 4 different salaries for a doctor or a nurse, I think speaks to, it's my mentor, speaks to the need for centralization. But overall, everyone was extremely helpful and eager to help with my research, which for me was specifically important because I was interviewing people, asking for them to do research, and following up with them a few times to clarify things. And overall, it was just a really friendly, welcoming atmosphere at ORCI and in Tanzania in general. In terms of my career aspirations, I'm not positive exactly what I would like to do, but from this experience, there are certain skills that I would like to use professionally. So I definitely enjoyed the quantitative aspects of organizing data and doing the analysis and trying to strategically plan what to do. I also really enjoyed the collaboration aspects of working with people and really understanding insights as to why the head of the screening clinic thinks that they're not getting asymptomatic women, which he actually believes is because people don't want to go to the hospital unless there's actually a problem. So that's also something to think about. And then also working with global populations I was really enjoyed, and also because they're still in the process of downstaging, I think that there's more area to contribute more viscerally, which I appreciated. And then also just looking at all of this from a systems level to make recommendations for improvement. I enjoyed that and would like to use that in my career moving forward. And I would also just like to take a minute to thank Dr. Solomon, Professor Eastwood, who were here, who really helped me, as well as Dr. Masami, who was our on-site mentor, who was incredibly helpful and receptive to me, asking every week to set me up with a different doctor or nurse. And to Dr. Musalagi, who also gave me a good amount of his time to review all of my data.